Hello again, I'm going to do another review, this time of J.G. Ballard's very disturbing novel, Crash. Now, J.G. Ballard is a writer I've read books by before. The book High Rise, which has been made into a film a few years ago, is about a breakdown of a housing complex with the poor versus the rich. It sort of all dissolves into a massive bloodbath, very much a small-scale metaphor for the class war, capitalism, that kind of thing. Not so much capitalism, actually, but sort of a devolving back to our baser instincts. It had a lot of layers, basically. It was society on one level, and then by the end of the book, people no longer really thought about rich and poor class boundaries. It was pretty much every man for himself, and that was a very interesting book, I have to say. Crash, on the other hand, I would argue, is not quite as multi-layered. Crash is basically J.D. Ballard's satire on consumer culture. It's a very crude and strange satire. It does get its points across. Basically, he wanted to, in his words, rub the human race in their own vomit. The plot, basically, a man who is named after the author, is called James Ballard, has a car crash. And after his car crash, instead of being traumatized, PTSD-stricken by the car crash, it opens up new possibilities for him in the world of eroticism. And he basically gets sexually turned on by car crashes and meets this TV scientist called Robert Vaughan, who is also obsessed with being sexually turned on by car crashes. And his attempts to meet these desires become more depraved throughout the book until Vaughan dies. It's not a spoiler because it reveals this on the first page. Vaughan dies in a car crash in a failed attempt to die in the same car crash as the actress Elizabeth Taylor, because J.D. Ballard mixes in celebrity obsession as well as the sort of technology-based themes of which the book is based on. Now, this is arguably J.G. Ballard's most famous novel, although I'm not entirely sure how much it's to do with the quality of the actual book and more a combination of its novel premise and the fact that there was a film of the book made by David Cronenberg, which I'm told is one of his best films, although I have yet to see it, or many of his other films. But it's not quite as good as I expected. You've heard of the Bad Sex Award, right? I mean, it's not quite as embarrassing as Morrissey's passage from his book a few years ago, which I've read, even though I haven't read the book itself, and it's fucking hilarious. But I do feel like any literary work which tries to describe sex in any way in a literary fashion is going to seem a little bit, I don't know, a bit unbelievable. I feel like writers such as, I'll give the example of Thomas Pynchon, where he writes the sex scenes in Gravity's Rainbow. They're very much satirical and they're supposed to be ridiculous and not realistic. But I mean, obviously the ones in here aren't realistic as well, but they're supposed to be taken seriously. You're supposed to put yourself in the shoes of this strange and depraved character. But I feel like the descriptions are so literary and almost scientific as well. I mean, Ballard has a background in medicine before I went into novel writing, that it's difficult to sort of put yourself in his shoes. Most things, when they're described in this sort of literary, high-minded way, sort of become more vivid. But this very sort of physical experience, which is throughout most of the book, almost becomes the opposite. You're distanced too much from the action. Some of this might be intentional, I suppose, because the character, the protagonist, is not very sympathetic, obviously, because he fucks car crashes. But it's not a prose style which lends itself to being engaging. On top of this, the book is very samey. I said this about Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche a few months ago, but that book sort of made up for it by being incredibly poetic and interesting and saying what it had to say in a lot of different ways. Crash is basically the same thing throughout its length, with very little variation. It's descriptions of car parts, people having sex in cars. Very few car crashes, surprisingly. Just sort of one at the beginning, one at the end. The main ones. It's not as disturbing, actually, as it sounds, because the car crashes aren't as frequent as the blurb implies. But, needless to say, it does get boring after a while hearing descriptions of people fucking in cars all the time. And even though it's only less than 200 pages, look at that, it's very nice and slim. It becomes a little tedious hearing about the same things over and over again. As I was saying before, it's very clear what Ballard wants to say in this book. It's all about our fetishization of celebrity culture and technology and how that all comes together in the sort of most extreme way possible. But I would argue that there isn't much more to it than that, and it doesn't quite justify a book of this length, even though it is not that long. It's more of a short story kind of concept. It doesn't have the depth I think a novel requires. Very unlike High Rise, which I was talking about earlier, which is a far superior book, even though it's not quite shocking. It is pretty shocking anyway. That had multiple layers to it over the course of the book. And it wasn't sort of a singular mission statement like this. I've said a lot of critical things about the book so far, but I did enjoy it. As samey and weirdly scientific as the prose style was, it was still a joy to read. There was a lot of great phrases to describe various car crash victims, and you really sort of felt like, maybe not so much on the sex scenes, I've already said, but in the bits in between, and there are plenty of bits in between, you do feel like you're there. Ballard is very good at immediate prose, which is poetic enough for a sort of high-minded literary novel. I have to do that, so I don't seem pretentious, which I am, but immediate enough for the sort of bracing kind of book that he's trying to write. It's not a classic realist novel. It's a short, sharp, and shocking type of book. Like in any novel, I think, there are standout moments which sort of bring it up. And I'd say the particular standout moment in this is towards the end, when Ballard and Vaughan go on an LSD trip, and the description of this sort of becomes elevated above a sexual thing, and the road and the cars become almost a divine experience. An armada of angelic creatures, each surrounded by an immense corona of light, was landing on the motorway on either side of us, sweeping down in opposite directions. They soared past a few feet above the ground, landing everywhere on these endless runways that covered the landscape. I realised that all these roads and expressways had been built by us unknowingly for their reception. I said the book wasn't particularly multi-layered, and I stand by it, but there are hints of more interesting themes which could be explored if the book was a bit longer, or maybe if there was less descriptions of people fucking in cars and fantasizing over car crashes, which obviously needs to be there, but there could be less of them. And that's the sort of aura of cultish worship that surrounds Robert Vaughan. He's a very interesting character. I suppose keeping him mysterious is a good thing, because he's the sort of character whose motivations would ruin him if we were given some sort of backstory to why he's as fucked up as he is. But if we would explore his followers a little bit more and what drives them, I think the book would have been better. I've said a lot of negative things about the book, but I enjoyed it a fair amount. So I'm going to give it a C grade, which is slightly lower than my last few reviews, but there was a lot of flaws which made it not quite the masterpiece that it's cracked up to be. But a lot of things aren't, when you really think about it.